So I'm pleased to be here today with Brad Liber.
Good to see you.
Brad is a former high school coach who went back to school to get a master's in education and then served for 7 years as a high school teacher. He taught multimedia production, English, and American literature, among other things, and coached several sports in the San Diego Unified School District. Brad, welcome to Think Deeply.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Let's begin with your background. Tell me a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, went to school, your work experience, especially your experience as a teacher.
I grew up in San Diego, California, and I lived there from about 0 to 18. And I graduated from high school and moved on to be a Division I athlete at the University of Washington. And from there, I moved to New York City and I started working in photography and filmmaking, lighting. And I met my now wife and moved back to Los Angeles where I could keep kind of doing that. And when I came back to the California area, I started coming down and I started helping coach my old coach in cross country and track. And once I started doing that, I loved working with kids, and I was getting a little less enamored with the on-off lifestyle that was filmmaking. And so my coach said, "Hey, why don't you become a teacher?" And I loved working with high school kids. So I went back, I got my master's in education, and I was offered to teach video production, multimedia, and I taught American literature to juniors. So all my experience was in high school, 9th through 12th graders.
Great. Well, that sounds like a fun experience to work with those kids and really have an impact both on and off the field. What did you see when you first started teaching, and how did things change over the 7 years that you served as a teacher in high school?
Well, I started teaching in kind of an interesting time. It was right that my first year teaching was actually the year we entered COVID. When we first started, students had not had any sort of hybrid education. They had not been remote. They were pretty much, that means there was kind of an unbroken chain of socialization through the kids. They were growing up and they had cell phones, but they were still hanging out together. And once COVID hit and students were at home and they were off and they were learning on Chromebooks and they were off by themselves, things started to change quite rapidly with both the students and with what I started to see curriculum driven from the districts, and also just kind of what was expected of teachers. A lot changed pretty quickly.
Well, that whole experience with the pandemic really turned the world upside down, and I'm sure it was tough on teachers. It was very difficult for parents, and certainly the students were twisted and turned in unimaginable ways. You did some work on the ethnic studies curriculum around that same time. I think in 2020, California passed Assembly Bill 101 mandating if there was funding, which has never come to pass, the teaching of ethnic studies in the schools. And I think you did some training for that, or you were proximate to some of that teaching. What did you observe there, and how did that land with you?
I never taught ethnic studies personally, but I was seeing a lot of the carryover into my American Lit juniors class. And I would say that was because particularly American Lit is this blend between history and literature and our founding documents. And so there is a lot of play between what students were learning in ethnic studies and then what they were bringing into the American Lit classroom with me. Some notable things that I would start to say were sort of a reinvention of what historical significance America and the West sort of had and how it became what it is today. There was a lot of omission and changing of the history. So things such as the 1619 Project, things such as reframing American exceptionalism and Western exceptionalism into instead a hierarchy of people that were powerful and people that were not powerful. It was just a very binary look at the world. We talked about how in American Lit, we would talk about the Declaration of Independence. We would talk about Jefferson. We would talk about how America was founded on an idea. And those ideas ultimately were about personal agency and what you could get out of your life through hard work and being conscientious and building a community. And instead, that kind of got flipped. Ethnic studies program came in and instead told students that it wasn't about who they were as a person and how their characteristics were, building character, building their own values. It had everything to do with external factors. Everything was just, it was systemic in the sense that I feel like they were pushing kids to think that they were brought up in a box and they couldn't break out of that box. And once that framework was put in place, I started to hear it in my students. I would hear them say to other students, you can't speak on certain matters because you look a different way, or you couldn't possibly understand this because you come from a different background than me and you couldn't understand anything and relate to me in any way. And when I started to hear that, it was kind of like some flags started going off. And so I started digging deeper into, hey, what was this ethnic studies program about?
Well, the whole idea underlying education, I think, is teaching students what they have in common and how to debate complicated issues. And most of these issues are complex. They're not simple. The pandemic was complex,
Right.
and ethnicity is complex, and America's origin story and Constitution is not cut and dried. So when you turn it into a binary, it really dumbs everything down. And to tell students that they don't really need to think about what they have in common or take apart these complexities, but they're all simply a byproduct of their immutable characteristics, their skin color, their ethnicity, whether they are first or second generation Americans. English is their first language. They rent or they live in a home that their parents own. These are not the things that ought to be driving it. What we are advocating for at Think Foundation is a system where these subjects can be taught in the complex way that they deserve to be taught. And through that process, students can learn how to debate and they can learn how to disagree in an agreeable fashion. And they can learn about compromise and coming together. So maybe unpack that. How do those concepts stack up with the way you observed ethnic studies to be taught, and where was critical thinking in all of that?
So how I think about what the ethnic studies program has done, or its goal became, was something you hit on, which was traditional education, at least that I came up in, and I think a lot of other people came up in, was, hey, we're in America and we all look different. We're all from different backgrounds. We're in public education. Some of us were wealthy growing up. Some of us were not wealthy growing up. So, I mean, I was not one of the wealthy kids growing up. And we were trying to relate with each other based on our commonalities, our shared interests, goals, our character. It was far less about what we looked like. And I feel like from what I saw happening in ethnic study in what I saw happen in the ethnic studies program was the focus becoming about immutable characteristics, like you spoke of. It wasn't about how you can relate to people. It was how you're different from everybody. And in fact, it was, you're different from other people because of a system that is in place, that's been in place for hundreds of years, and you can't break out of it. And that shut down a lot of conversations with students. Students started to group together instead of, and they're grouping over how they look. They weren't grouping over their ideas or their interests. And they certainly weren't then venturing out to find new community. And high school and education is so much about trying new things, trying to be in different groups, trying to relate to your surroundings and who you are and learn who you are. And instead, it was as if they were being prescribed an outcome. They're saying, you look like this, you're going to get this outcome. And we're here to tell you that that's going to happen. And how I've always laughed in a way that feels like it's so counter education, because the goal of education is to empower individuals to critically think and become their own person in any kind of system, in any kind of environment. And instead, it's taken the onus off of the education system and off of the students as well to say, hey, look, if you're not achieving, it's not really your fault. And if you're not getting what you want out of life, it's not your fault in any way. And the teachers that kind of propagate this, I think also are getting a very large benefit from this. They have this sense of moral superiority perhaps with it, or they feel that their compassion is so strong that they need to convey this message. But, I kind of have branded it in my brain as it's a manufactured grievance. It's perpetuating grievance. It's manufactured victimhood in the sense that you're taking the actual, in a weird way, in a very real way, you're actually diffusing the real horrible experiences of people in our country in the past. And you're trying to now distill it down and dilute it with saying people today are experiencing the exact same things. And I think that's a disservice to the past. I think it's also a disservice to the people today that you're pushing that on. And I swear a lot of teachers just think that they're doing good work by doing that.
Well, it's the antithesis, Brad, of what you're trying to teach players or athletes on the athletic field, which is if you work hard, if you give it your all, if you work together as members of a team, we're here for each other and we want to come together and we're stronger together than we are separately. And this is really quite a different sort of a message, which is if you're from this ethnic group, you know, you're an oppressor and you should feel guilty. And if you're from this other one, the deck is stacked against you and you can never succeed. Maybe compare and contrast those two hats that you wear, the teacher and the coach.
Right. Well, okay. So as a coach, absolutely. We're looking at merit. We're looking at hard work. And I would say it's just I would say it's a natural model for dealing with an interpersonal relationship with anybody. You know, we approach each other as a coach, you approach your athlete with where they're at. As a teacher, you should approach your student with where they're at. And you should find out their strengths. You should find out their weaknesses. You should see the things that they're interested in. And you should be trying to build up those things. And students are needing mentors and they're needing coaches and they're needing their teachers to be doing that, not to look around the room as a coach and look around and say, well, this group's going to be this way because of the way they look. It's a ridiculous way to look at a relationship where you're a mentor. It's affactual and it's dangerous for the kids. And you're in this very sensitive position to be a trusted adult. And they look at the outside world through you. You know, we're kind of the filter, which is why I always love coming from the professional world before becoming a teacher, because you're kind of the filter between the outside grown-up world and education. And they look at you to sort of tell them what to expect. And when they're being told to expect that they can't overcome their immutable characteristics and that they are either in the categories you spoke of, they're either an oppressor or oppressed. And that's the whole world.
Well, it's doing those things for the ethnic groups, and it's also doing those sorts of things for whole ideas. It's saying that capitalism is evil, that America's and Western democracies are fundamentally oppressive societies, and these are completely arbitrary political ideologies that are plucked from on high and transplanted into kids. And I guess it's one thing if you're a college student and you can have reasoned debates and discussions, and it's another thing if you're 15, 16 years old and you're told by the authority figure that which is true, and you don't really have the skills or the training or the context, as you said, to debate it or to push back on it. So it really creates some pressures on kids that they don't need.
Right. You know, I kind of look at the whole thing as it's kind of a rebranded Marxism. Ironically, why it's shifted from the traditional, what we all think of as Marxism with economic status and economic class and class warfare, why that hasn't been able to grab traction in America is because capitalism has worked. And there's so much mobility within America in every sense. There's you don't have to look further than Barack Obama. You have many notable examples. You have if you actually even look at the economic top 10%, if you actually look at the mobility that happens within top 10% of the income bracket in America, it's a revolving door. It's not a static group of people. There has been so much opportunity here to come from nothing and build your own business, build your own brand. These students are actually starting, I believe, to understand that now, because they're starting to see people that are their age go on YouTube and become billionaires. And they're starting to like, wait a second, this is not what I thought it was. And so the Marxism that we kind of classically just think of doesn't work. And so they've had to sort of rebrand this as a it has to be race-based. And so they have decided to make this completely racial. And by doing so, they are, um, I think they're putting up a serious block with students learning, just like you said, the jobs of the future. If you can put a student into a box and say, you will never outgrow this component of yourself. Everyone will always see you as your skin color first, and that will be your worth. That's how people see you. That is such a limiting factor you put on a human being. And I think that's ultimately the scariest part about it is it green lights racism both directions. And within the ethnic studies program, when we were learning, when we were being told, we were told that there's no such thing as reverse racism. And that was hammered a lot. They showed videos about it, and they were told there's no such thing as reverse racism. And people, you could tell the room was bothered by this. But it was explained in these videos they're telling us. They said, well, there's no way to impact a white person negatively through racism. That's what they said. And I thought that was really, not on so many levels, I thought that was very confounding. But as a teacher, how this message gets perceived by young people and what goes on is it green lights racist actions against certain groups of people. And it makes it so that if you're being told that you can't be racist to a white person, for instance, it's not about this. This is not a grievance of someone who appears as white saying this. What is a problem with this is that a student getting greenlit to be racist towards anybody is a programming to judge people based on their skin color. And to tell them that that's no longer racism is a really dangerous thing to say, because they now can take that exact same way of behaving towards any group that they really don't like if they choose to. It's a
permission slip for bad behavior, which is unhealthy.
Yes.
Yeah, when you tell this story in a high school environment, people who are unfamiliar are left scratching their heads. But if I told you the same story about a heart surgeon or an airline pilot and said, well, you can go to anybody who's qualified to perform this surgery or fly this aircraft as long as they are exactly like you and they're your skin color and your age and your exact, go outside those bounds, and you can't have confidence in the competence, and that of course is unhealthy and not how our country and system ought to work.
Oh yeah. If you told a young black child growing up in elementary school that white teachers will never understand them, and then by the time I get this student in high school, I mean, how terrible is that there would never be trust, that there can never be trust between them and me because of something they've been told their whole life. It's just not true. And it's be on all their social interactions, who they marry, who they date, who they work with. I mean, this is a poisoning of the well, really, and it's a poisoning of trust in a community that is. We are the most ethnically diverse country, I believe, in the entire planet. And so when you really drill down on that point, you realize, well, gosh, how does it serve people to tell them that they need to silo together into a group of people that look just like them and they can only trust those people? How could they ever do that?
Well, how can you possibly imagine that you will get the best outcomes if you don't include all the people and all the talents? We need women and men. We need every racial group. We need young and old. We need everybody to contribute that which they can contribute to our society. And if we do anything that is unwelcoming or exclusionary, we won't get the best outcome, just like on the athletic field.
Oh, exactly like that. I mean, if you had students just say, oh, I'm just going to play on the team that looks the most like me, they might never discover the sport that they get a Division I full ride scholarship in. They might never discover, and those are your friends too. That ends up being your tribe when you're in high school. Everyone knows that students become, they get raised by their peers at that point. They all raise each other together. They all grow up together. And if they are suddenly grouping based on these ideologies that they've been told at very young ages to not trust people that don't look like them, I mean, there's so many things that they wouldn't try. There's so many people that people won't talk to, and that is so stifling.
We need more opportunities and more open doors and fewer fewer roadblocks and fewer closed doors. Well, Brad, it's been a great conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to leave me with today?
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, honestly, I believe that ethnic studies is, and I've said this in our conversations in the past, so I want to be very, very clear about this. Ethnic studies needs to be taught, but it needs to be taught as actually ethnic studies. It can't be a rebranded Marxist ideology to impregnate young kids' minds with this concept that racism is ever present and is the invisible hand that is going to control their entire lives and their outcomes and who they can trust and who they can be friends with, everything. Ethnic studies needs to focus on the actual histories and cultural awareness that we all experience here in America, which there is so many. And there's nothing about my opposition, or I believe your company's opposition to, or revealing about what's been going on in ethnic studies that is against history, that is against the truth. What we're after here is the actual truth, something objective, and not the subjective truth of cherry picking and essentially lying through omission about history. You know, focusing on components of certain forms of slavery, you know, but not this other kind of slavery, or not focusing on the actual history, just taking out little pieces of it and lying that way. So as I see ethnic studies, is it needs to be taught, but it needs to be taught in a way that's not radically ideologically Marxist and through the framework and the lens of oppressor and oppressed, which is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, there's so many ways to attack it factually, through data, through history. There's just so many ways through people's actual lived experiences. It does not hold water. And for students to be put through this program, it needs to be removed so that public education can get back to being a place for everyone, a place where everybody can experience each other and focus on their characteristics. And we need to grow students based on their own values and their own characteristics and build them up, as opposed to silo them into these little groups so that we can have some other agenda. Public education has a future with ethnic studies, but not with the modality in which it's taught.
Well, we can learn plenty about ethnic studies by looking at the American story and our history over the last several centuries. And I think if we teach history, warts and all, we've made a lot of progress and we're imperfect. Both things can be true at the same time. And there are lessons for all American students and for those from every ethnic group if we tell the whole truth and we tell the whole story and we let people sift it out for themselves rather than spoon feed it to them. Well,
Right.
thank you, Brad. It's been a great conversation.